Welcome to the HoosLeft podcast, a show about Indiana politics, history, and culture from the unapologetic perspective of the Hoosier left. My name is Scott Aaron Rogers, and I'm Rick Lillington. I've spoken often in this space of the quirks, pitfalls, and idiosyncrasies of our two-party arrangement in this country, and the all-or-nothing first-past-the-post voting system most electoral jurisdictions use that ensure such a setup. In political science, this is known as Duverger's law. So instead of a multi-party system with each party representing a different voting bloc, the disparate factions sort into coalitions within the two major parties, and these alliances change over time in response to changing real-world conditions and strategic considerations. This is how we've gone from the pro-slavery Democratic Party of the 1800s and their radical abolitionist Republican counterparts to the white nationalist GOP of Donald Trump and their pro-diversity Democratic analogs. For example, the Miller Center at the University of Virginia describes the New Deal coalition, quote, "With FDR at its head, the Democratic Party put together a formidable coalition whose main components were lower-income groups in the great cities, African Americans, union members, and ethnic and religious minorities, many from recent immigrant groups, and the traditional source of Democratic strength, the Solid South." End quote. Meanwhile, the Republican coalition of this era consisted of the college-educated professional managerial class, corporate and business interests, mainline Protestants, and libertarians. These alliances fell apart in response to the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and the economic crisis of the 1970s. In particular, Goldwater, Nixon, and Reagan employed the Southern strategy to coax small-town, rural, and Southern conservatives, and the newly powerful bloc of evangelical Christians, out of the Democratic Party and into the Republican Party with dog whistle language like the Pied Pipers of racism. Over the course of many years, as many of these deplorables came aboard, large numbers of liberal Republicans, which used to be a thing, jumped ship, with the professional managerial class and mainline Protestants largely moving into a reimagined Democratic coalition. By now, the Southern strategy is well documented, and if you're listening to me, I bet you've heard of it. But, along with the racists, another faction, former Trotskyite Marxists, disillusioned by the authoritarian turn of Soviet communism, jumped from the Democratic to the Republican coalition in response to the social unrest of the era. From an article in The Week magazine from 2015. Quote, "It started out as an insult. The founders of the movement were liberal intellectuals who became disenchanted with the direction of the American left during the 1960s and 1970s. Their original goal was to reform the Democratic Party from within. But mainstream leftists scoffed at these people who called themselves new or neo-liberals, saying it was more apt to call them neoconservatives. The first neocons soon embraced the name. To them, the prefix highlighted the fact that while they had once been leftists, they now had a new orientation. Irving Kristol, the godfather of the movement, defined a neoconservative as a liberal who has been mugged by reality." Quote. Now, these folks still adhered to one of the core beliefs in liberalism, that the federal government could be a force for good. They supported the civil rights movement and thought a well-conceived welfare state was a net positive, but were driven by vehement anti-communism and a commitment to aggressive American military intervention to oppose the countercultural revolution, the anti-war movement, the 1972 McGovern campaign, etc. these former Cold War liberals came to form one of the most influential factions of the Reaganite Republican Party. Since this period of realignment in the 70s, the neoliberal consensus has replaced the New Deal consensus. Big GOP wins throughout the 1980s led Democrats to move right on both economic and foreign policy. This from American Affairs in winter of 2017. Quote, both blocs supported free trade, low corporate taxes, curtailed labor rights, the primacy of shareholder interest, winner-takes-all compensation, and financial deregulation. Both blocs elected leaders who sought grand bargains aimed at cutting entitlements. The key differences between them turned on recognition, not distribution. So, for the last 40 years, give or take, this worldview has come to dominate both parties, with Republicans representing a reactionary neoliberalism and Democrats espousing a more progressive neoliberalism. The same article continues, quote, at the core of this ethos were ideals of diversity, women's empowerment, and LGBTQ rights, post-racialism, multiculturalism, and environmentalism. These ideals were interpreted in a specific, limited way that was fully compatible with the financialization of the U.S. economy. My guest today swam in these waters for some time and learned a great deal. She kept some of these ideas, evolved on others, and discarded the remainder. Deborah Pickett is a Democrat running for Congress in Indiana's 5th Congressional District, currently occupied by the reactionary Republican Victoria Sparks. This predominantly white jurisdiction is the wealthiest congressional district in Indiana and is comprised of Hamilton, Madison, Delaware, Grant, Tipton, and most of Howard County, including northern suburbs of Indianapolis like Carmel, Noblesville, Fishers, and Westfield, as well as Muncie, Kokomo, Anderson, Marion. From her campaign website, quote, Ms. Pickett proudly served in the U.S. Army Reserve, researched international trade and economic issues for the Hudson Institute, and has been a tenacious advocate for Hoosiers of all generations. Her admiration for Hoosiers' innovative spirit and hard work make her an unwavering advocate for the people of the 5th District. In partnership with the people of Indiana, Ms. Pickett will lead the charge for smart policy, effective and efficient government, and helping the people of Indiana help themselves. She believes that the people of Indiana know the best and most workable solutions for themselves and their families, and they deserve to be at the forefront of the decision-making process. End quote. In this conversation, we will discuss her youth growing up on the Hudson River in New York and the environmentalism she learned from her parents and grandparents. We'll also talk about her time as a researcher with a neoconservative think tank many years ago, before diving into some of the big issues in this race: the economy, healthcare, education, and national security. Before we turn to the interview, please consider supporting HoosLeft with a paid subscription. I currently work as an independent craftsman during the day and work on this project whenever I can. There are so many more things I want to do here at HoosLeft: more campaign finance research, more live hangouts, a daily episode if we can get there, but I need your help. So if you can, visit scottaaronrogers.substack.com and subscribe at the paid level. For $5 a month or $50 a year, you can help me push our state in a better direction, and maybe if we reach critical mass, I can put down my tool belt and devote my full time to you, to this project, and to Indiana's future. So if you have the means, pause right now, go to scottaaronrogers.substack.com and subscribe at the paid level. And while the best way to help this project is financially, if that doesn't work for your budget at this time, you can still help. Subscribe at the free level over on Substack. Set your favorite podcast player to auto-download new episodes of the show. Rate and review the show on whatever platform you use. This trains the algorithm to help new people find us. Follow me on social media on Facebook, Blue Sky, YouTube, and TikTok at HoosLeft. That's HOOS Left. On Instagram, Threads, and Twitter, I'm at ScottRog78. That is SCOTTROG78. And on Mastodon at ScottRog78 at Hoosier.social. Please subscribe on whichever platforms you use and send me a DM to discuss ideas for the project. But most importantly, spread the word. Forward the articles to friends, family, and colleagues. Don't just like, but share on social media. Invite others to our little corner of the Indiana left. And I might be the guy with the microphone, but I try to take this thing where your input leads me. So please, be generous with feedback, good, bad, or meh. I value it all. To those who have joined this community already, especially those paid subscribers, thank you for believing in me. And to everybody, thanks for listening. Now, here's my interview with Deborah Pickett. Deborah Pickett, welcome to the Who's Left podcast.
Thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, you are the Democratic candidate for Congress in Indiana's 5th Congressional District. Why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself, how you grew up, came to be where you are today, a little bit about your life, and what prompted you to throw your hat in the ring and run for Congress?
Well, I grew up in a small town in New York State, in a big, large family, a big military family. My father had graduated from West Point Military Academy. My uncles, so big military family, and I also grew up around a large family with cousins and aunts and uncles. And we lived up in the woods, and it really was, in so many respects, so idyllic. I just love we were outdoors all the time. We were hiking. So I grew up, really feeling very much loved and inspired by the outdoors. And I also had grandparents who were environmental activists, although originally my grandfather had worked for a big law firm in New York, and had represented Exxon. And so when Con Edison wanted to build a power plant in our community, my grandparents, my grandfather, really decided to fight it and really organize this extraordinary effort and managed to defeat the project. And one of the outcomes of their efforts to defeat Con Edison power plant, Con Edison Company, was the founding of the Natural Resources Defense Council, which was one of the very first environmental law firms. So I grew up, and then they also were very much involved with the cleanup of the Hudson River, which had been tremendously polluted by chemicals and sewage. And so this was also another cause that my grandparents were very devoted to. And so I grew up around grandparents and parents who were very much involved and committed to their communities. My mother was always involved, served on the local hospital board and worked at the local wildlife museum. And so, and then just through all of the, and then the other experience that was really invaluable was growing up in a military family, because for many years we lived overseas. And so that exposure to foreign cultures and, different languages just has always piqued my curiosity about the world. I've just, felt that the world is such a fascinating place, and I just wanted to learn about it and be engaged with it.
Oh.
And so that still continues to this day.
Yeah, where did you get a chance to live overseas?
We lived in Germany and in Mainz, Germany for a year, and then we also lived in Friedberg, and so uh, sort of pivoting a little bit to my own experience, I also lived when I was older, after I graduated from college, for a year in outside of Paris in France, and so those experiences were very pivotal in my curiosity about the world. But I also joined the United States Army Reserve and served in two different capacities. One was as a behavioral science specialist with a 55th Medical Detachment, and then also as an intelligence analyst with the 21st Support Command that was based in Indianapolis, and that was also based in Indianapolis. And one of my most favorite training experiences in the military, my Army Reserve experiences, was training for 3 weeks with the Germans as we working on. We had to bring the mission was to bring a hospital that had been mothballed up and into operation, and then we also worked with the Germans in coordinating evacuation plans and a lot of joint military exercises. And just think about that. Really think about how the fact that during World War I and World War II, the Germans were our fierce enemies, and this does show you that what can happen over time, and with the goodwill and with a framework and treaties and a rule, the world order of rules and laws and framework and accountability, and you can really these relationships can evolve into such important partnerships.
Yeah, fantastic. So, you said you got the chance to go to Paris after school. Where'd you go to school?
I went to Skidmore College up in Saratoga Springs in New York
Okay.
State, and actually I was a theater literature major. And my last semester at college, there was an internship with a small organization based down in New York City that needed someone to go to the state legislature in Albany to sort of drop off literature and to talk to legislators about election law reforms and like gerrymandering. And I applied for it, and and you want to know what? No one else had applied for it. So I got this internship, but it took me in a completely. I just absolutely loved it. I love I love being there in the state legislature. I loved the the interesting issues, and that took me. I've always loved theater, but I have never done anything with it, and just have always from that point on went I went from that great internship to working for a small little non-governmental organizations right down there in New York City, based situated right across from the United Nations, that worked on that assisted developing countries on developing their new renewable educational capabilities. So you had a lot of developing countries like the Philippines or like the Dominican Republic that were very interested in adopting some of these new technologies, solar power, solar energy, micro hydropower, ethanol, and but they didn't have the capabilities or capacity. So how do you train people in your communities to have the skill set to be able to develop, build, integrate these technologies into your energy planning? And so that really, I've always been interested in new renewable sources of energy. That was something that I was doing back in the 1980s, and you could see that experience at that time and to this day. When we're talking about these new technologies, there's no technology that is perfect, and there's no technology that does not have a downside to it. And that is something that I would say, is a consideration today when we're talking about the adoption of of solar power and wind energy, and they are absolutely phenomenal. But they do have the technology for solar power panels. You're having to mine. Those minerals are
Mhm.
mined. Um, it's possible now that they're being mined in the United States, but they were for a long time being mined in South Africa, and it was the Chinese that were extracting it, and the Chinese then were taking those minerals and taking them back to China and processing them, and then so the process of making those solar panels is not always. It could be a very dirty one, and so that's just something that has always been with me, is understanding that we really, when we make decisions, whether or not it is about energy policy or energy technologies, that it's really important that we take into account what are all the different facets of that technology, and that we weigh, that we really understand what the repercussions are going to be, and that a real good understanding what the cost and benefits are going to be of those technologies and how we integrate them into our communities.
Yeah. I understand looking at complex issues from many different angles. Well, number one, I'd like my Congress people to have that ability, but number
Yeah.
two, you spent a lot of time doing that professionally.
Yes. Yes, and that is really one reason why I really wanted to run for office, was because of a of a frustration about a number of different things. One was, I felt that the legislators, those people who are making these decisions, have become removed from those people who are most impacted by those decisions, and I felt that there was a real gap between what those their understanding what those policies are, and those who are at the receiving end and who have to access them, that that those people who are making those policies do not grasp what the full repercussions are on the end user, the person who's using them. And then there was a tremendous feeling: are our legislators listening to the people? Do they understand, and do they understand the heart, and the spirit of what their community is dealing with? And so I talked about a little bit about my military experience, and I talked about my experience a little bit at Hudson Institute. But the other experience that has been really valuable to me has been my volunteer experience over decades. And that has been serving on different boards and serving on different committees. I served on the board of a nursing home for decades. And so you're dealing with everything from Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement rates, and how do you, the financial aspect of it, plus, and most importantly, what are the difficult decisions that people are making as they near the end of their lives, and how do they have control over how they live those days, and how does the individual and family face that very, very difficult period of time in your life, and what are the ethical implications sometimes of how we die. So there was those issues, and then the other, then I also had worked with for decades, a family that was going through the foster care system, and they're still incredibly dear to me, and that has given me great insight into what are some of the challenges that young families are dealing with, single parents are dealing with, the educational system, um, and how how I'm deeply worried. I think that that it's an insult on how little we pay our educators today,
Mhm.
um, and they play such a critical role in our societies. Into building that whole human capacity, and our skill sets, and our emotional um, and mental well-being, is tied up with those kinds of experiences that we have at school and in the educational system. And I just, I think I'm deeply concerned by how I think our resources, our money is now been diverted away from the public education system. And I think that's really not serving us well.
Yeah, it's a travesty. So, let's talk a little bit about what brought you out to Indiana? So, like, you were a New York girl, huh?
I was a New York girl. Well, Hudson Institute, um, which is this public policy research organization that was based in New York, the Hudson Valley, had an opportunity to move out here to Indianapolis, and had a really wonderful, sweet deal with the Eli Lilly Foundation. There were several number of people who were really instrumental in helping to persuade Institute to move out here, and so it was a thrilling sort of opportunity for me. And so I came out as a junior researcher and worked initially on their education policy studies, and then moved to work on their international trade and economic studies, where I worked and supported their research on international trade and economic studies, which was an area that has tremendous importance to the our international and our global leadership and economic growth.
Yeah, absolutely. So now I looked into the Hudson Institute a little bit because, that's the kind of guy I am, curious. I poke and dig. And I'm seeing like red flags all over the place. I'm like, who is this Democratic candidate
Right.
working at this Hudson Institute? Because I'm like, this is an incredibly conservative institution. I saw
Right.
that they split off basically from the Rand Corporation. And if anybody knows anything about the Rand Corporation,
Yeah.
they were like,
Oh, yeah.
the stalwart think tank of the Cold War.
Absolutely.
And I get the founder, Herman Kahn, basically got run out of the place for being too into nuclear war.
Right. Right. Yep.
And like apparently inspired the Dr. Strangelove character.
That is exactly right. Yep.
Now, so this institution, this organization, they move out to Indiana, and I'll be damned if Mitch Daniels didn't spend some time as the CEO in the late '80s there.
That's right.
And like some of the current fellows, like Bill Barr, Elaine Chao, Nikki Haley, Mike Pompeo. This is a murderer's row of like arch conservatives. So I guess what gives, Deb?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and actually, while I was there, Mitch Daniels was my boss at one time, so that is is very true. Uh, so I oh, I was such a great experience when I worked there, and I learned so much. And at that time, when I worked there, it was a couple of decades ago, at least. That was really when it was a very exciting time, because that's when we had a lot of trade agreements were coming into place, including NAFTA, and so it was at that time. I'm trying to think. I don't think the focus primary the studies that I worked on were economic related, and were basically had to do with a lot of international trade, and looking at the industrial policies of Brazil and Mexico and South Korea and Japan, and looking to see what was it that they were doing that we needed to, what did their industrial policy look like? How were they supporting their industries? What did they do that would put their industries at a greater advantage to United States industries? What was that business environment look like? What were those markets like for our businesses? And so that experience was just, to me, invaluable, and is still incredibly relevant today. And we have become even more globally interconnected. We have so many multinational corporations. Even in the state of Indiana, we have a number of multinational corporations, and they rely heavily on those international markets. And we, look at the supply chains, and these supply chains, these lower costs had come there have been two tremendous benefits that I don't think we talk enough about. One is that the price of goods is so much less expensive. I mean, you look at every one of us right now, this computer that we're how we're communicating, our cell phones. I mean, these are consist of all kinds of components that come from all around the world. And you have, and look also about, the designer, the engineers who have designed these products. Well, I mean, they also come from different parts of the world. They've been trained, trained in India, but also have gotten a lot of training here in the United States. So it's a global world, and it's thrilling when we are all the problems that we are solving are also global and interconnected. And so this, the work that I did at Hudson Institute, and that the role that the studies that Hudson worked on, or the studies that they were engaged in at that time, are still, that focus is still incredibly important. And and that is something that I just that I will absolutely take to Congress. It will be one of the things. So I'm a Democrat, but I will. There were principles that used to be very fundamental to the Republicans and to conservatives, which were free markets and low tariff. Basically reduce those trade barriers, remove lower tariffs, and remove import quotas. That they just really help allow the business person to have flexibility in how they are going to produce and manufacture their products. And I think we've now become that is something that I had a tremendous problem with the Trump administration, and I really was hoping that the Biden administration was going to roll back some of those tariffs, and because they're inflationary, they're taxes, basically. That's what they are on people. So anyway, the Hudson Institute, those economic policies are ones that I learned while I was working there. And I think they're just as relevant and just as important today as they were back in the 80s.
Let me ask you a couple things about that. You mentioned the lower prices, certainly. Did we throw our own organized labor and our laborers in general in this country overboard for lower prices?
This is, of course, such an important issue in my district, in my 6 counties. And it's very different, actually, because each of my counties is different, has different sort of demographics and different issues. But the truth of the matter is that we have become so much of our manufacturing capabilities. I mean, if you look at the volume and the value of our manufacturing, it is exploded, and we are a really manufacturing powerhouse. But it has absolutely come. The workers right now, it requires so many few workers because everything is robotics and electronic. And so that is that has definitely impacted manufacturing, the laborers, the workers. The other thing that has also happened over time, I mean, there's such an absolute valid concern that those international markets where you could manufacture, you can get T-shirts, for $5 that come from Thailand or from Vietnam or come from China. And so the textile industry in the United States was completely disrupted. There are many industries that were absolutely disrupted because of these, because of the global, these global trade agreements and but I think that there are other things that are more complicated when it comes to our workers, and that has to do with, for example, the fact that actually, and this is something that my opinion has evolved on, has to do with we've moved away from pensions and 401ks. So if you are sophisticated and have a good understanding of investments, you're able to know how to use a 401k very effectively, and you can. But what has been what we've come to discover now is that so many people who had 401ks have not taken full advantage of them, and either people that have retiring whose financial position is incredibly vulnerable, and their sole source of retirement income now is their Social Security payments. And so this is something um, that is a really big issue for so many of my constituents. Is they're not
Yeah.
prepared for the retirement, and they rely heavily on their Social Security payments, and those pensions meant that people could retire with secure source of monthly funding, and they had benefits that could really help them through the retirement years. And now they're so much more vulnerable than they were before when they had those benefit packages. And so it's a matter of whether or not the job still exists, and it also has to do with the benefit packages that these workers no longer have.
Yeah, I'll tell you, we used to, have a lot of private pensions, and yeah, those all went away as organized labor lost power, right?
Right.
And I will take a unpopular position for a leftist, and I'm from the left. I don't think the private companies should have to pay pensions. I just like it makes it all entirely too complicated. Like, why don't we just have generous Social Security benefits? People might have to pay higher taxes, but that extra stuff out of the way. It's just a checkpoint for some Wall Street guy to make a buck. Get rid of it all. Generous Social Security.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you. So I'm hesitating here because I was just thinking about this the other day. You know that our stock market and the ability for someone to really use, if you invested in an S&P 500 stock index, there are ways that the person who has no wealth, if you put money aside every month, you could build a very nice, comfortable retirement. A lot of people are not aware of that, but there is a way through private investments, through the stock market, to be able to build a good retirement. Just a lot of people don't have that, haven't learned that skill set, and so therefore, and this is what has shown, this is what has been seen that it was happening, because the 401k gave a lot of workers that flexibility to invest in the stock market and the bond market, and but they didn't take advantage of it because I think it was very intimidating to them, and I think
Yeah.
also they were very intimidating, and they didn't know how to negotiate it, and also that their immediate demand sort of trumped their long-term retirement plans, I think. And so all I can say is, I mean, you raise an interesting point here, because the truth of the matter is the majority of Americans rely heavily and solely on their Social Security payments. And so, if people don't have that skill set, and if that's the only way that people, yeah, I mean, you could do both, but I haven't thought about that. I haven't thought about that point that you're making, Scott, but it's a very interesting and probably a very good one, because our Social Security payments mean that also that people still don't have a lot, that's still inadequate for them, particularly when you do take into account our healthcare costs,
Mhm.
and inflation. So, I haven't thought about making the Social Security system more robust. I thought about how to make sure it can be sustained and we can honor those commitments to all those people who have been paying into the system. Social Security is a system that workers been paying into all of their working years. So, but anyway, that's something for me to think about, Scott.
Yeah, well, and same thing with the healthcare system, right? Look, I'm a Medicare for all guy. I mean, the system we have is unnecessarily complicated because there are a bunch of checkpoints at which private interests have to come in and take their cut. Get it all out of the way. Like, the most efficient thing to do, and the the most effective thing to do is what every other advanced country in the world does, and that's have, single payer universal health care.
Yeah. Well, and my main, there are a couple of concerns. So I'm also in favor of universal health care. And it's interesting that what has been shown here in our country is we are a very compassionate country. And it doesn't make a difference whether or not you're a Democrat or Republican. Actually, when you look and you see, we are what has happened is that our healthcare system is incredibly fragmented, because every time there is a major health crisis, you have, whether that's a Republican administration or a Democratic administration, there seems to be some health crisis that arises that requires government intervention and assistance. And so, what they found actually is that there are tremendous amount of inefficiencies, because you have now you have programs that are available to people once you get sick. They're not there to prevent you from getting sick, but once you get sick, you can then access those dollars, whether or not it's because you're experiencing kidney failure. There also were programs during COVID that existed that people were not even dollars that were available to them, but the terms were very limited, and people were not even aware that they could access them. And then, of course, what has happened was there are a lot of people, as the system has readjusting, who were all of a sudden now are disqualified for Medicaid, who now have to re-enroll for the programs. And so there are all of these glitches that really make the whole process so much more, as you said, cumbersome. And what has been found, even in the state of Indiana with the Healthy Indiana plan, was that, of course, everyone, you really do want to encourage people to take a lot of responsibility for their health. And you should have a little bit of ownership in contributing to that healthcare system. But they found that even with small amounts of contributions with the plan, that the actual administrative cost, the cost of administering the programs, that would require the recipients to contribute a small amount, like $10, that it's very costly to administer it. And that when you look at do the analysis, that the amount of money, the administrative costs, were greater than the amount of money that you actually would take in. So there's this inefficiency in a system. You're trying to compel people to take responsibility for their health and to contribute financially to it. But what ended up happening was, actually, if you looked at the cost of it, they exceeded the actual amount of money that you would bring in. So it turns out that it's very inefficient. And it makes really better sense to have people that are automatically enrolled in a program, and that there are different tiers of care. And you pay additional if you want a higher level of care, or if you want a private room, or you want to have that there's a basic set of health care that everyone is entitled to. And then you pay for additional money. You pay additional money for a greater level of care, or or certain benefits that might,
like economy and business class. Yeah.
It's exactly. And what has been shown also, when you look and study what happens internationally, is how do you pay for it? And there are some countries where you're automatically sort of taxed on it, and you do not have to pay for it. And those are the ones that actually tend to have the greatest the least amount of problems in financing their system. And but with all that, so that's where I stand on healthcare. The one thing that that my husband worked at Eli Lilly, and it is incredibly expensive to develop a new, pharmaceutical products. The whole process is uh, a very protracted one and a very expensive one. And so I would want to make sure that the United States of America always remains a leader in developing pharmaceutical products and developing, biomedical technologies. I mean, this is a whole area now that is explosive, and the opportunities for healthcare and for new treatments is just it's now it's thrilling, and I would want to make sure that the United States can be a leader in those new technologies and in the healthcare field. And so, and we are like we lived in England for 2 years, and you can get free healthcare there, but you had long waits. You had
Right.
long waits to get there. You had to
Gotta
go.
wait a long time here now, though, right?
You
I
did,
mean,
not as long, not as long. It would take 3 months to get the results back of a Pap smear at that time.
mm,
This was a couple of decades ago, and so it's been a while since I've been there. So I cannot speak to what the wait time is like now. But the other thing too is there was a tremendous shortage of specialists. And we had personal experience with our daughter who needed a pediatric immunologist, and there was only one pediatric immunologist in all of the United Kingdom, which included Ireland, Scotland, and Great Britain. Um, Whereas here in the United States, in the state of Colorado, there were like 20 pediatric immunologists. So there were incentives that and the hospitals. I mean, so my daughter was hospitalized for 2 nights, and I'm telling you, it was something that was it was on a ward with all of these metal beds, with just a curtain in between the beds, and they lost the blood work that had been done. I mean, it was so completely different. The hospital was um it was so very different than what we had here in the United States. Now, do we need? I don't. What we have here in the way of our facilities and our equipment far surpasses what I saw in England. And there were certain medical treatments you cannot get in England that are widely available here in the United States. That's why I mean, if you have a serious medical issue, people come from all around the world to the Mayo Clinic and to the Sloan Kettering. They want to come to the United States of America for our treatments. That's really where. So I would want to make sure that the United States, when we in the process of reforming and reforming our healthcare system, that we always manage to maintain a really leading edge when it comes to innovation in the healthcare industry.
yeah. I don't know. We wouldn't stop innovating if the CEO had to take a haircut, would we?
That is a big problem, right? Come on. I get very impatient with these CEOs and with the executives, and and you look and see what the executives are paid versus what the workers at the lower rung, and there's just such an inequity, and it just I think it makes people so feel so disenchanted with capitalism, because they see these huge differences, and it shouldn't be that way. That to me is just we need to care about each other, and we need to care about our workers, and we need to make sure that they get paid well, and that we look at our own. That means if we need to, we take a haircut with our salaries and benefits, so that our workers will benefit more. I have a very difficult time with that.
You know, there are so many systemic things that we could address. But even if we changed nothing else other than like the top marginal tax rate, I mean, look, you can say you make as much as you want a year. You big number big. Okay, your number's bigger than the other guy. Great, fine. Yoink, we're going to be taking a big chunk of that now. But you could still say you made X, $1 million this year, right? So, one of the things you said, way back when we were talking about Hudson Institute was you work on a little bit of education policy.
Yes.
Was that right?
Yep.
You're not to blame for charter schools, are you?
No, but you know what? It's interesting because Hudson Institute was absolutely one of the very first organizations to really to look at them and to promote them. And I could as a and initially I was very supportive of charter schools and school choice. And I think that they evolved as a way of trying to circumvent some of the restrictions of the teachers unions, and the teachers unions many decades ago were if you had a very bad teacher or you had a bad administrator, someone who really should not belong in that field, it was very hard to fire them. And so I think it was a way of trying to circumvent, trying to get around the teachers unions, and I think that over the years, my opinion has changed because of how I have seen the money go away from the public schools, and how I've also seen the demise of so many communities because of children. You know, communities evolve and build around schools. And so what happens when you no longer have your neighborhood school? You there are several things that happen is that community devolves or it just weakens, and it's not easy for a child to get up and get out the door and get to school. They have to rely on the school bus, they have to rely on the parent. And um and and then all of a sudden the community commitment to that school, the community's interest in the children in that community diminishes also because they don't see the children, they're not interacting with the children. Now, it's hard for the Mrs. McMilligutty, the woman who used to go out and get a newspaper and see the child passing on her way to school with her books and say good morning. You don't have those interactions anymore, and you lose these little threads that help to build the scaffolding of a wonderful neighborhood school community. And I saw this when I was with a family. I saw this experiences firsthand with a family who had been removed from their mother's care, were in foster care in the foster care system, and they were spread all around the city. And one of the foster mothers had put two of the children in a charter school, which was on the opposite side of town. And they would literally get up at 5:30 a.m. in the morning to catch the bus to get them from 38th and 465 all the way back to over to Keystone and 86th Street to go to the,
Oh, geez.
and so and what would happen would mean that one, this foster mother could not easily get to the school for teacher parent conferences. And the other thing is that what would happen would be after school or on the vacation times, that the ability to bring the children together, you couldn't easily go outside and have a game of basketball because your friends no longer, they were spread all around the city. So the wonderful ability to go out and say, hey, let's have a game of basketball, or let's play baseball, or those wonderful little interactions with community and your neighbors just did not happen. And I really think that the sense of community spirit has diminished because of the way that schools, because of this option now where it's like we just need to have world-class schools in every community, and they need to be available and accessible to the children and their families so that it's not a burden to get there and to participate in the school.
I think one of the major problems around this, and this isn't really a Washington issue so much as a state issue, but
Right.
the fact that education funding is tied to local property taxes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's fundamentally discriminatory against low property tax areas.
Oh, I absolutely agree with you. And I saw that up in the Lake County District that when we had last year for the referendum, the school referendum. The school referendum passed overwhelmingly here in Carmel. and in Fishers, and they just because there's just first of all, we just so many of us really value education. We just know the value in help and preparing our young children for the world ahead and all the challenges. And that we just had a little more of the financial means. But up in Lake County, in that district, up in that area, the referendum, school referendum, and you could, the assessment was much higher than what it was going to be in Carmel because the property values were much less than they are here in Carmel. And their ability to pay those assessments was also, they just didn't have the same ability to pay those assessments. It was you could see it was really punitive. And I walked away from that situation and felt there was such an inequity, and that the community and those children and those schools and that up in the Lake County districts were not going to be able to, their education experience was going to always be compromised because of their inability to raise the money that they needed to support it. And so I would absolutely be in favor. I mean, this is not an issue that I would be dealing with in Congress, but this is a state issue, would be revamping that formula for how you pay for those schools in all the different districts in the state.
Yeah. Well, what is an issue in Washington is, Republicans and Project 2025, they want to get rid of the Department of Education entirely.
Absolutely. It's just so deeply troubling how they want to eliminate some of these departments, like the Department of Education, that all of a sudden the other thing that is deeply troubling has to do with who is going to staff those agencies. And it seems as though instead of your experience, your knowledge, it's going to be based on your loyalty to Donald Trump. And that is, that is absolutely, that's what happens in a banana republic, where you have people who are, it's because of the money that they donated to their a candidate, that they serve in that position because of their loyalty to that leader, and because of the financial contributions that they made, or how they help that person, not based on their skill set and their experience and their knowledge of the issues. And it's deeply troubling, concerning to me about even the Environmental Protection Agency. So that I know. The Internal Revenue Service. I know that under the Biden administration, they finally were able to secure more funding. Well, thank God they were able to do that. But the Republicans have continued to try to roll back to
187,000 IRS agents coming to knock.
Well, we needed desperately. The Internal Revenue Service only has the skill set to audit those people who are, the middle class. It requires a certain level of expertise. You have to draw talent from the private sector to come and work at the IRS to be able to evaluate and look at these more complicated tax returns, where you have people who have pay their accountants thousands of dollars to find every loophole in the tax code. So, yes, I am deeply concerned by what would happen with a Trump administration and Project 2025, and what happens to these government agencies and the staffing is deeply troubling. And it, you will continue if these. I mean, that's one of the priorities of my campaign. First one was preserving our democracy and our democratic institutions, which is it's imperfect, but it provides an overarching framework for how you bring people together with different viewpoints and a clamorous voices and disagreement. I mean, this is the beauty of the United States of America, is that we can disagree vociferously, but we have a framework, and we have institutions and organizations and the rule of law to make sure that when we come together, and fairness and justice is absolutely paramount to what we're trying to accomplish with this process. And it's, bringing people together and making sure that the power rests with the people. And this is something that when I look and see what happens with the Trump administration and with those people, including, Congresswoman Victoria Sparse, who says the most important thing we have to do is to, put Donald Trump back in office again, and Jim Banks. I mean, these are people that have been supporting insurrectionists who believe that it's okay to overturn the results of a legitimate, fair, and legal, presidential election. So, anyway, so, the democracy, and the democratic institutions, our personal rights. I mean, our personal rights have been under attack. Our freedoms have been under attack. And, our people's trust in government is tied to how effective and efficiently our government operates. And, and the Republicans, by defunding it, by not funding it accurately and by not, and making sure, and not funding it accurately, and also not staffing it properly, and our legislators not doing their work. I mean, Congress, under the Republican leadership, the House of Representatives, under Johnson, has been inept, and keep being brought to the edge of a government shutdown because they can't get a funding package. So
We've got people, yeah, in dire need of like more FEMA assistance now, and Republicans, instead of rushing back to Washington to pass some sort of supplemental spending bill, they're playing politics, and even worse, lying about the administration's response to Hurricane Helene.
it's disgraceful. It's utterly disgusting and disgraceful. And that's why I'm hoping to be elected to go to Congress to represent the 5th District. And I will do my very best to make sure that I follow the rules that are put in place, that I am respectful of the rules and laws, and understand that they are there to, hold me accountable for my constituents to know, am I beholden to any interest groups? What am I serving them, or am I serving my own personal interests? That's the other thing too. Right now is the third quarter. We have candidates all around the country. We have financial reports that are due to the Internal Revenue Service and to the Federal Election Commission.
Yeah, we do.
And I'm telling you, I am working so hard to make sure that my reports are accurate and truthful. Why should I, and this is the case with whether or not you are a Democrat or Republican, I want to make sure that they are truthful. I take my responsibility very seriously, but I get so furious when I think about Donald Trump and his disdain and his, unwillingness, how, the 34 counts of, result in federal charges, have to do with his lying, regarding political campaign finance, violating political campaign laws and thinking it's okay and whining about it. He wants to think this is what makes me so furious, is that there are so many of us out there, the majority of us, who want to play by the rules. We understand the reason for these rules. We understand that the purpose of this reporting has to do with our constituents' ability to see what we make and how we make it, and whether or not we are in it for ourselves or for them. And you have a president who is just a former president who just is disdainful of these institutions and the rules and laws, and he thinks he should not have to abide by them. And it makes me really furious. And I'm reminded of it right now because of having to do my own financial reporting.
Mm-hmm. So we've only got a couple minutes left, and excuse me, I did want to give you a chance to talk about Mr. Trump's loyal sycophant and your opponent, Victoria Sparks. Now, you used to be an intelligence analyst. Does she give you anything to work with?
I'll tell you, I cannot understand how it is that someone who grew up in Ukraine and had
Once again, That was Deborah Pickett, Democratic candidate for the United States House of Representatives for Indiana's 5th District, which includes the northern suburbs of Indianapolis, as well as Kokomo, Muncie, Anderson, and Marion. At the top of the show, I talked about the two-party system, different factions moving around within that system, the New Deal consensus, and the neoliberal order, which replaced it as the dominant political worldview in the United States over the last 40-plus years. If the last 10 to 15 years have seemed like a period of chaos, that's because we are living amid another major reordering of the parties, just like 1968 to 1980. This is the breakdown of the neoliberal order. The global financial crisis of 2007 and 2008 kickstarted this era of instability, and the new consensus has yet to coalesce. I've used this one before, but nothing sums up the current moment better than the following quote from early 20th century Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, quote, "The old world is dying, and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the monsters." End quote. The article I referenced earlier in American Affairs talks about attacks on the dominant paradigm from both left and right vis-a-vis the 2016 election. Quote, "Both Sanders and Trump excoriated the neoliberal politics of distribution, but their politics of recognition differed sharply. Whereas Sanders denounced the rigged economy in universalist and egalitarian accents, Trump borrowed the very same phrase but colored it nationalist and protectionist. Doubling down on long-standing exclusionary tropes, he transformed what had been mere dog whistles into full-throated blasts of racism, misogyny, Islamophobia, homophobia, and transphobia, and anti-immigrant sentiment. The working class base his rhetoric conjured was white, straight, male, and Christian, based in mining, drilling, construction, and heavy industry. By contrast, the working class Sanders wooed was broad and expansive, encompassing not only Rust Belt factory workers, but also public sector and service workers, including women, immigrants, and people of color." End quote. Sanders ran as a progressive populist, Trump as a reactionary populist, but neither's take on populism were realized. Bernie narrowly lost his primary to Hillary Clinton, while the Orange Menace pulled a bait and switch. Quote, "The policies of President Trump have diverged from the campaign promises of candidate Trump. Not only has his economic populism vanished, but his scapegoating has grown ever more vicious. What his supporters voted for, in short, is not what they got. The upshot is not reactionary populism, but hyper-reactionary neoliberalism." The Biden presidency was supposed to represent some sort of return to norm, right? I've touted his relatively progressive domestic record. But let me be clear. Normal, the neoliberal consensus, sucked. It delivered us to this current place. Labor unions were disempowered. Wages for all but the richest among us stagnate. Over $50 trillion was funneled from the bottom 90% to the top 1% last half-century. The oligarchs have picked the good meat from the planet's carcass while the rest of us fight over the scraps. The old world deserves to die. But what kind of world is to be birthed in its place? I haven't gone down this rabbit hole to disparage Deborah Pickett. Quite the contrary. Just like Cindy Worth down in the 6th District, who I spoke to several weeks ago, she's a highly intelligent, big systems thinker. I value her policy chops because she understands all sides of big, important global issues. It's not her that's got me in a mood. I know goddamn well a leftist like me isn't going to win Carmel, Fishers, and Noblesville. It's going to take centrists. I guess I was triggered by the company she used to keep, but her work for the neoconservative Hudson Institute was decades ago, and I take her evolution in good faith. And while we probably still disagree on many issues, and it's okay because democracy is messy, we just heard her express support for basic universal health care, guaranteed, automatically enrolled, untethered to an employer. We heard her advocate for high-quality public schools, higher taxes on the rich, and, oh yeah, a democratic republic with personal rights and freedoms like reproductive health, choice of partner, or whether one wants gender-affirming care. Because that's what this is really about. Beating back the authoritarians like Trump and Musk and Netanyahu and Putin, and their useful minions like Victoria Sparks, who would destroy the very institutions, however flawed they are, on which those rights and freedoms rest. It will take a popular alliance between center and left to defeat fascism. Deborah Pickett is on the right side of that fight. So please, if you live in the 5th District, vote for her enthusiastically and drag your friends to the polls to do the same. But let me close with this. I've long dreamed of building a New Deal coalition for the 21st century. A Green New Deal coalition, perhaps. And I believe this will require something along the lines of a reverse Southern strategy, like peeling the largely Republican suburban middle class away from the increasingly unhinged MAGA wing of the party. This process is already well underway. Call it the Suburb strategy. So, in the name of democracy, to those wandering neoconservatives, I say, warily, welcome home. It's good to have you back under the big tent. But please, check your free market fundamentalism and preemptive wars as you happen. Thanks for listening. District like Deborah's are the front lines of this battle for hearts and minds, so help her campaign by visiting at picketforcongress.com and volunteering your time, talent, or treasure. The link is in the show notes. Early voting in Indiana is now open. Use it. Vote as early as possible and dedicate the rest of the time before Election Day to making sure others vote. Tell everyone you know. And finally, if you're feeling extra generous, after you've contributed to the Pickett campaign, of course, head over to scottaaronrogers.substack.com and help support this project with a paid subscription. That's where you'll find everything I publish, but you can also find me on Facebook, Blue Sky, YouTube, and TikTok at HoosLeft, and on most other social media sites at ScottRog78. My DMs are open for feedback, tips, ideas, and concerns. You can also email me at scottrog78@gmail.com. Forward the show to a friend and have them forwarded to another friend. Let's keep building this project in a more democratic Indiana. Until next time, this has been the HoosLeft Podcast. I'm Scott Aaron Rogers. Love each other, Indiana.